you to the February meeting of the Gonzaga Socratic Club. The Socratic Club takes as its inspiration the Oxford Socratic Club from the mid-1900s, which was presided over by C.S. Lewis. And we follow the argument wherever it leads concerning understanding Christianity in a deeper way. And so the topic that we're going to be addressing today about faith and reason is particularly appropriate. New atheist Richard Dawkins likes to describe faith as belief without evidence. While his objective is much more polemical than descriptive or analytical or reflective even for that matter, it's fair to notice that the question of how faith is related to reason and evidence is one that has occupied a range of thinkers throughout Christian history. A colleague and I were just talking about Kierkegaard, for example, whose Protestant post-Reformation critique of the excesses of natural theology might be regarded as a kind of poster example of this. But all the way back at the beginning of the Christian church, Tertullian's famous comment, "What has Athens to do with Jerusalem?" signals and even captures in a very descriptive way that question about what does philosophy or reason or evidence have to do with faith. And even St. Paul himself, in St. Paul we find a tension. In Romans chapter 1, St. Paul offers a robust defense of natural theology, arguing that the things that can be known of God are shown clearly in the things that are made in creation. But at the same time warning in Colossians 2:8 against hollow and deceptive philosophy. So what are we to make of this? What has Athens to do with Jerusalem? How are faith and reason related to one another? Our speaker today is Jeannot of the Religious Studies Department here at Gonzaga. And he's going to be drawing on insights from perhaps the most notable, or one of the most notable, Jesuits of the 20th century, Bernard Lonergan, to address the question of whether reason trumps faith. So, let's say welcome to Dr. Jeannot.
Thank you, David. Thank you all for coming out. This is a nice surprise. I know some of you are sacrificing happy hour to be here, so you're to be congratulated for that. Or perhaps this is happy hour. So, as David mentioned, I'm taking up the basic question today. Does reason trump faith? So, I'll read for the most part from the paper I have prepared, and then I also have some slides. So, I'm totally a slave to the podium, but for the most part, yes. So, I'm starting by situating the conversation in relation to some criticisms of contemporary atheist critics, and then also trying to incorporate a potential way of framing the relationship between faith and reason by drawing on the works of Bernard Lonergan. So, Project Reason, a think tank founded by Sam Harris, author of The End of Faith, states in its mission that it exists to challenge religious ideas. It argues, quote, "Both science and the arts are built upon cultures of vigorous self-criticism. Religious discourse is not," end quote. That may be news to many religious people. And it betrays a profoundly unscientific ignorance of the material contained in quote-unquote religious discourse. The presumption embedded in the statement is that reason refers to critical thinking, while faith describes blind adherence to authoritatively declared propositional truths. I don't intend to debate Harris or his colleagues at Project Reason in absentia, but simply to take up the question embedded in this way of framing the issues. Does reason trump faith? In large part, answering that question depends on what one means by the terms. Thus, an alternate title to my talk this afternoon might be, with a nod to Alistair McIntyre, Whose Faith, Which Rationality? Conversations about faith and reason too often neglect these two questions. Faith and reason are not univocal terms, after all. Faith, as the pronoun indicates, often refers to a personal horizon, but not exclusively. It can also be used to refer to certain creedal or dogmatic formulations, what we often refer to as the deposit of faith. Reason, on the other hand, can refer to any number of the conceptualizations of human cognition that make up the field of epistemology. So some Christians oppose faith to the claims of modern science. Contemporary critics of religion like Sam Harris use reason against faith and declare an end to faith. The First Vatican Council, 1869-70, however, affirms that it is possible to know the existence of God by the natural light of reason. That council goes on to condemn rationalism, even while affirming there can never be an opposition between faith and reason. But how can we embrace the complementarity of faith and reason as Catholic universities claim to, when the variations of each are many? In this presentation, I would like to draw your attention to the unique contribution the late Canadian Jesuit Bernard Lonergan makes to this conversation. Lonergan's career was spent in large part grappling with these fundamental questions in his major works, Insight and Method in Theology. What we find in Lonergan is an account of reason in his generalized empirical method, and a synthesis of faith and reason in his analysis of human conscious intentionality and its movements from below up and from above down. So today I want to introduce you first to Lonergan's elaboration of cognitional theory. Some of you who've had me in class already know this. Second, I'll show how Lonergan handles the notion of faith. And third, I'll bring the two together in the dynamic unity of the believing and reasoning subject who exists in a human world of meaning. So first, reason. There's nowhere to be found in the Western philosophical tradition of consensus on epistemology. That should be the first question that pops up when you hear the word reason. What are we talking about? And so no consensus on what is meant by rationality or reason. That human beings possess some capacity we often refer to as reason is regularly affirmed, but the ways in which reason is described and elaborated vary widely. When our contemporaries invoke reason against faith, we should find ourselves asking whose account of reason or which rationality. After all, Augustine is not Ambrose, Aquinas is not Scotus, Molina is not Suarez. But should we then despair at arriving at any consensus? Lonergan thought not. In order to combat the modern common sense notion that knowing is a matter of looking at what is there to be seen, Lonergan returned to Aquinas. In his explorations of Thomas on Intelligere, Lonergan discovered the elements of an account of knowing that was verifiable in experience and that embraced the human subject in all its concrete complexity. Lonergan's long apprenticeship to Thomas laid the groundwork for his magnum opus, Insight. He had already shown in some earlier articles on the notion of verbum in Aquinas that cognitional theory in Aquinas is expressed in metaphysical terms and established by metaphysical principles. But in the intervening period, a massive paradigm shift had occurred in philosophy and the sciences, the shift of modernity, toward a statistical verification in the sciences and the turn to the subject in philosophy. This demands that we begin with consideration of the psychological facts of knowing rather than universal and necessary causes. So a shift away from metaphysical terms and relations to empirically verifiable terms and relations. So the shift is methodological. It is related to a distinction made by Aristotle and Thomas between what is first for us and what is first in itself. To take the metaphysical terms and relations as a starting point is to explain things in relation to themselves. And Thomas, following Aristotle's science as understanding things according to universal and necessary causes, uses this method. To begin with cognitional theory, however, is to start with what is first for us, in order to identify a verifiable account of knowing grounded in the concrete experience of the knowing subject. And Lonergan does this by attending to the human experience of acts of understanding. He sums up this project in Insight with a slogan that Lonerganiacs like myself commit to memory. Thoroughly understand what it is to understand, and not only will you understand the broad lines of all there is to be understood, but also you will possess a fixed base and invariant pattern opening upon all further developments of understanding. So thoroughly invites the reader to come to a decision by attending to his or her own experiences of questioning. An insight in order to understand understanding. This is a process Lonergan refers to as self-appropriation. Pay attention to yourself in the process of understanding, in order to understand what understanding actually refers to. With Lonergan's help, the reader attends to the fact that cognitional activity begins in the experience of wonder and the tension of inquiry. We human beings ask questions, and our asking isn't just wondering for the sake of wondering. We intend answers. Questions drive toward answers. So in Lonergan's account, our answers are not reached by mere experiences or perception. Rather, they emerge as the term of a process of experiencing, understanding, and judging. Our intending unfolds on these three distinct levels of conscious activity linked by questions. Experiences of the sensible and conscious data lead to the question, what is it? The question moves us to further investigate and attend to the data until we experience an insight into some intelligible pattern in the data. Subsequently, we seek to express what is learned in insight by formulating a guess or hypothesis, or a definition that sits at the level of understanding. But our definition is only a guess or hypothesis. We want to know if we have understood correctly, and so we inquire, is it so? To answer that question requires marshaling and weighing the evidence until insight breaks through again, and a recognition that the conditions that would have to be fulfilled have in fact been fulfilled, or that sufficient warrants have been established to verify our definition. From such a reflective insight comes a judgment in which the definition is affirmed. Such, very briefly, is Lonergan's cognitional theory. It's not a set of prescriptive steps to be followed, but a description of what we do every day when we ask questions and try to answer them. Oops. Lonergan calls his account generalized empirical method. It is general in that it transcends disciplinary methods. It is empirical in that it remains grounded in the concrete. And it is a method not in the sense of a prescribed set of steps or rules for knowing, but in the sense that it refers to a set of recurring and related operations by which we in fact know. We can verify these acts do in fact occur by attending to ourselves. Nevertheless, they occur in a context that is not always favorable to experiencing, understanding, and judging correctly. Lonergan identifies this problem in his account of bias. So if we just have this part of Lonergan, we think there's a kind of a realism there, but it's not very critical. Right? There's a sort of an image of a pure intelligence engaging with phenomena and leading directly to judgments without problematizing the experience itself from the get-go. Lonergan knows that, and so he takes up the problem of bias. Human beings, as postmodern theorists have clarified, do not exist in a state of pure nature. Just as an individual incorporates the common sense insights of a culture in which he or she is educated, so also one often retains various cultural biases that constrain and distort detached and disinterested inquiry. Lonergan identifies three variations of what he calls bias. There's the individual bias of the egoist, who, though his intellect is operative, restricts his line of questioning to his own concerns. There's the group bias that distorts the intersubjective spontaneities of human community by restricting their range to the interests of the members of one's group only. As groups compete for advantages, their range to the interests of members of one group only. As groups compete for advantages within the social order, the order itself becomes distorted, and political power becomes a tool for implementing biased versions of reality. Politics as power. The distortion of both individual and group biases are further exacerbated by the pervasive influencing culture of what Lonergan calls general bias. So what's general bias? General bias relies on a belief in the omnicompetence of common sense. We have a lot of this in our culture. While common sense can be specialized and often sophisticated mode of understanding things in relation to us, it's prone to overstating its claims. Common sense tends to seek practical solutions to current problems without too much concern for the long-term ramifications. It wants results. Consequently, detailed theoretical analysis of potentially harmful courses of action is disregarded as impractical by general bias. Likewise, science is frequently ridiculed because it seems to contradict the obvious evidence of common sense, e.g., climate change debates. But the general bias of common sense has vast implications, because its broad influence reinforces what Lonergan calls a longer cycle of decline. And in that longer cycle of decline, culture often retreats into ivory tower exercises. Religion becomes strictly a private affair. Philosophy, as Lonergan says, glitters like a gem with endless facets and no practical purpose. The relegation of detached and disinterested inquiry to the status of a relic spells the collapse of a culture in decline. By its restriction of thought to the realm of the practical, general bias creates new forms of culture, religion, and philosophy. We find these new forms today in the common sense politics of short-term solutions, or the common sense religiosity of Christians who seem as ignorant of Christianity as they are of science. We find it also among the common sense accounts of reason that proliferate among scientists and philosophers who proceed in a rather unscientific manner as they claim to disprove the ideas of religion. So, what do we know by reason? This is how it happens. It happens in a context that's complicated by bias. What's its goal? What does it seek to know? This brief summary of the fundamentals of Lonergan's cognitional theory begins from a consideration of the desire to know common to human beings as manifested in the wonder that asks questions about experience. He identifies the experience of insight that reveals the advent of understanding at least a portion of the intelligible data we experience. And insight, by the way, are the little light bulbs. I figured out. Insight enables us to formulate our understanding and definitions and concepts that in turn call forth a critical awareness that asks, am I right? Is it so? And reflective insight reveals either the sufficiency or insufficiency of the evidence to drive us to affirm or deny the correctness of understanding in our judgments. Furthermore, knowing is not a single, obvious, incorrigible intuition, but a process that moves from what William James described as the buzzing, blooming confusion of the infant's world of immediacy into a world that is already linguistically and culturally constructed, what Lonergan calls a world mediated by meaning. That larger world, mediated by meaning, what we usually refer to as the real world, is not of our own making. It is a concrete historical reality that our desire to know encounters. It already includes any number of ready-made answers that constitute the common sense of a culture, including its biases. Consequently, if we are to know anything beyond the conventions of our culture, if we are to face the Socratic question whether the opinions of our culture actually explain the truth of things, and to move with Newman from shadows and images into the truth, then we have to understand correctly what it means to understand in order to be sufficiently critical, and in order to attain the real as real beyond convention, even beyond scientific convention. Whatever the obstacles we face from bias, in fact, we do know things by having insights, formulating them in definitions, checking them out, and judging that we have understood correctly. And when we understand correctly and judge affirmatively, what we affirm as true is this world mediated by meaning. And I'll explain a little more about that in a second. So that's Lonergan's account of reason or rationality. What about faith? Lonergan expands his notion of human conscious intentionality sketched very briefly here to include greater attention to values and feelings in his later work, Method and Theology. Although he had in his famous or perhaps infamous chapter 19 of Insight sketched what some have considered a proof for the existence of God, Lonergan later admitted that what he had produced there was not completely adequate to the method he had been pursuing in the previous 18 chapters. So in Method, Lonergan pays increased attention to the affective dimension of human living and expands his intentionality analysis to include one, and some argue two more levels, which regard deciding and loving respectively. The last is the level of faith. Faith is not in the first instance a matter of affirming certain abstract propositions or even of holding their meanings as true. Faith is concrete. It is an experience. It is most closely related to the experience of falling in love. Lonergan describes faith as the knowledge born of religious love. At other times, he describes it as the eyes of being in love, but to encounter in relationship, usually mediated by community. That's the positive side of the cultural bias, potentially. Right? That you exist in a culture that can mediate both positive and negative understanding. So this is the element of faith that people without faith have the hardest time wrapping their heads around. Faith, at least initially, lacks conceptual content. You don't have faith in concept. The tip-off to that theologically is God is not a concept. If you think God is a concept, you've got a problem theologically. Right? God's not a concept. But wait, you might say, what about the creed? Indeed, what about creeds or doctrine generally? What is it the doctrine contains if not what we sometimes call the deposit of faith? Well, let me be blunt here. We should be very careful ever to equate the deposit of faith with the lived reality of being Christian. Has there ever been, or will there ever be a Christian who in every waking moment of his or her life holds as true all that is contained in the deposit of faith? The answer? No. Right? Those people don't exist. Okay? No recently baptized infant, for example, has ever given intellectual assent to the consubstantiality of the Father and the Son. And most of us, on a daily basis, think and pray in ways that are likely heretical. This is what it means to be a sinner. And yet sinners are not without faith. Indeed, to recognize oneself as a sinner already requires the gift of faith. This is precisely because faith is a matter of relationship established by God through the gift of supernatural love. In this way, we could call God the object of faith in very big scare quotes. But that is a further determination of a prior experience of falling in love. One thing to be in love, it's another thing to know what you're in love with. People who go through a process of dating engage in that. That's why dating is good. Doesn't happen much anymore. When faith is conceived in strictly terms of conceptual content, it's decontextualized, with the result that the faith of the first century Christian is radically understood to be different than that of the 20th century Christian. Sort of an irony there. If we turn faith into conceptual content, you really run into a problem with the lived experience of being Christian. For first century Christians and 21st century Christians don't share the same creed, for example. There are some who, in trying to affirm the timelessness of church teaching, seem to ignore this concrete fact. The content of dogma, insofar as it depends on revealed truth, is, according to Catholic teaching, certainly timeless, because the content of the dogma is God. But the conceptualization of faith is contextualized. The Trinity is eternal. Ways of understanding the Trinity, even those that become church doctrines, are contextual. Early Christians encountered Christ in their Eucharist, but they never used the term transubstantiation. What a first century and 21st century Christian share is an experience of falling in love and realizing that they have been loved first. So faith, to speak doctrinally, is a supernatural gift. Describing this gift in his 2013 encyclical Lumen Fidei, Pope Francis, or perhaps Pope Benedict, writes, quote, "Faith is born of an encounter with the living God who calls us and reveals his love, a love which precedes us and upon which we can lean for security and for building our lives. Transformed by this love, we gain fresh vision, new eyes to see." End quote. Faith is a seeing with the eyes of love, but it is not therefore opposed to truth, because love seeks the truth. All along the line, this self-transcending process of moving from experiencing to understanding to affirming is an unfolding desire of the human to know, which is a love for the truth, a love for what's real. So again, Francis/Benedict writes, "Love and truth are inseparable. Without love, truth becomes cold, impersonal, and oppressive for people's day-to-day lives. The truth we seek, the truth that gives meaning to our journey through life, enlightens us whenever we're touched by love. One who loves realizes that love is an experience of truth, and that it opens our eyes to see reality in a new way, in union with the beloved." So what might it mean to see the reality in a new way? Does a person of faith see a reality other than the one observed by a scientist? We have to further determine what we mean by reality. For Lonergan, as I mentioned above, the real world is a world mediated by said in the past is probably true. It can be modified, of course. But I always use the example with students. When you start chemistry, you don't figure out the periodic table. You use it as a given. Right? If you had to do all that work ahead of time, you'd never go anywhere. So we trust a lot. Most of what we know, we believe. So this is as true in the sciences as it is in religion, philosophy, politics, etc. Furthermore, what we know, when we know, is not the world of dogs and ducks, but a world mediated by and constituted by meaning. All the meanings and values that make up this world are communicated. They're not just an individual's meanings and values, but those of entire historical cultures, left them by posterity, which continue to shape history. So we live in a world that pre-exists us, not in the sense of its physical existence, but in the sense of its cultural, historical existence. Besides this accumulated tradition, the world of meaning is a concretely emerging world historical situation with its own intelligibility. So this is the world, the real world we get to know when we know things. Even when we know things in the sciences, we know things through the discourse of science about those things. We don't know the tree from inside a tree. We'll get clarification on that. Okay, so the world mediated by meaning. Lonergan elaborates a whole series of categories of meaning and method theology that I won't go into in detail here. But meaning begins certainly with cognitive kinds of meaning, right? Content that is strictly knowing an object. But also human meaning is affective, constitutive, and communicative. As we work out our meaning in the world, our meaning becomes effective as we intend projects and we engage in what Lonergan calls man's making of man. So making the human world takes us out of a purely natural setting and into the man-made artificial world that is the cumulative, now planned, now chaotic product of human acts of meaning. It's those effective acts of meaning that build bridges, right, and launch expeditions. Those are effective acts of meaning. They intend some goal. Constitutive meaning shapes horizons through culture, religion, philosophy, literature, etc. These meanings and values not only shape identity, but constitute people. It's an important insight to realize that I am constituted by my culture. Not restrictively, but in fact. Right? There's always, of course, a possibility of innovation. But nobody shows up on the scene in this sort of autochthonous way. Right? I just ask my students, does anybody here ask to be born? No. Right? Did anybody here ask to learn English or whatever their native language is? No. That's the water you swim in. That's what he means by constitutive meaning. But constitutive meanings can change. Think, for example, of the constitutive meaning of a culture that goes from living under a monarchy to living in a republic. There's a different identity that emerges from one or the other. But also in personal relationships. So when beloved and lovers say to each other, as so many will tomorrow, I love you. And when that person genuinely means it, a new reality emerges. A reality we sometimes call a relationship. But that's a reality. It has to do with the concrete experience of constitutive meaning. Furthermore, then, meaning is effective, constitutive, and also communicative. It is the meaning that's common to a community. And community is an achievement of common meaning. And because it is concrete, it is always emerging. It is potential, formal, and actual, to use the classical metaphysical terms in relation. Potential insofar as its meaning resides in common experiences. Formal when there is a shared understanding of experiences. And actual insofar as members of the community affirm common judgments and affirm and deny in the same way. So common meaning becomes real in history. Right? This is the reality of our experience as human, the common meanings of cultures. Each of us is born in communities of meaning, such as family, religious tradition, and nation. Within these communities, we become ourselves, either authentically or unauthentically, within a dialectical tension as regards the authenticity or unauthenticity of the community. And this is where community is not strictly determinative of subjectivity. It's a dialectical relation. Consequently, it might happen that What I am is one thing, what a genuine Christian or Buddhist is another, and I can be unaware of the difference. Lonergan says, my unawareness goes unexpressed. I have no language to express what I am, so I use the language of the tradition, which I unauthentically appropriate. And I thereby devaluate, distort, water down, or corrupt the language of the tradition. So describing the larger historical ramifications of this particular dialectical tension between the subject and community, Lonergan writes, quote, such devaluation, distortion, corruption may occur only in scattered individuals, but it may occur on a more massive scale, and then the words are repeated, but the meaning is gone. So the unauthenticity of individuals becomes the unauthenticity of a tradition. Then in the measure, a subject takes the tradition as it exists at his time, for his standard. In that measure, he can do no more than authentically realize unauthenticity. That is to say, there's not a desire to distort, but the situation is already distorted. And that gets passed on. So when critics invoke reason against faith, they seem utterly ignorant of these dialectics of subject and community. Again, go back to the quote from the Reason Project at the beginning, that there's no critical engagement in religious discourse. That's a profoundly unscientific thing to say. It just doesn't correspond with the facts. So what critics often identify as religion could in fact be authentically mediated unauthenticity. So when people say, you'll often hear people say that Islamic extremism is a distortion of Islam. Well, what does that mean? It might be more helpful to think about it this way. That there's something that's emergent in the tradition that's a possible interpretation, but that just starts to distort the interpretation. And in the context that people inherit is already a distorted interpretation. So the trick is, well, how do you get that? And what's the authentic thing? So authenticity is a problem here. So that's next on the docket. Authenticity, what is it? For Lonergan, authenticity is a matter of intellectual, moral, and religious conversion. So we've described faith in terms of a horizon. Lonergan elaborates the roots of that horizon by attending to three conversions that constitute the foundational reality he calls authenticity. So first, he does this in two different ways. You can do it from below up and above down. I'm going to do it from above down. But authenticity has to do with being faithful to this process in oneself. Right? So it's not sort of a authenticity in terms of romanticist philosophy. Right? It's not expressivist. It's authenticity in terms of adhering to the intrinsic dynamisms of one's subjectivity. But I'm going to do it from above down. You'll see what I mean. So in these three conversions, intellectual, moral, religious, it's often enough the case that what's first is a religious conversion. And that has consequences at the moral and intellectual levels. So in a religious conversion, the love of God elicits a conversion through which one falls in love with God in an unrestricted fashion and begins to operate in a horizon suffused with divine love. What Lonergan in one place calls emerging into a friendly universe. The universe can seem pretty hostile otherwise. Within that horizon, one's own good is transcended by the good revealed by the love of God, so that normally a moral conversion follows on a religious conversion. The experience of divine love as the supreme good transforms all our human questioning such that the philosophical questions about knowing and being are transposed into this new horizon in which they become ultimately questions about God. So every question about our experience then somehow becomes a question about God. An intellectual conversion may result so that the reality is no longer considered just a collection of sensible data, but an order that is completely intelligible because it has an intelligent ground. So Lonergan uses this term authenticity to refer to consciousness operating in the horizon of conversion. If in much theological reflection the aspect of religious and moral conversion receives significant attention today, this occurs in a rather undifferentiated way, so that intellectual conversion and the attendant theoretical differentiation of consciousness is nearly forgotten. As a result, theology is frequently dominated by narrative and rhetoric today, and natural theology has ceased to persuade, something David referred to in his opening remarks. This is not simply a bad thing. The Second Vatican Council itself certainly took a more scripturally grounded approach to its theologizing. However, narrative alone cannot deal adequately with the critics of religion who are only too happy to agree that all religions are really just stories. So how are we to assess these rival descriptions of reality? Longren's account of reason in terms of generalized empirical method and his account of faith in terms of conversion and authenticity bring the two together in the dynamic unity that is the human subject. As conscious intentionality unfolds on the level of experience and experiencing, understanding, and judging, we discover the intelligible universe of our experience known by scientists and the faithful alike. As our intending proceeds to the fourth level of deciding courses of action based on values, we bring all that we have understood and judged to be true to bear on our evaluation of policy and planning. But beyond these four levels lies a new horizon within which all one's knowing and doing is sublated into a larger horizon of care and concern for all that is, insofar as it is the gift of a loving God. Normally we think of our being in the world as proceeding from below up, from our experiences through understanding to judgment. This, after all, is the method we employ in the lab. But human beings also have the experience of love, eliciting a transformation of consciousness to the extent that how one sees the world changes fundamentally. It is the experience of being in love through which one sees the world through the eyes of the beloved. It's concrete, but it's a new world. So, you have these two vectors in logarithm. Normally when people talk about reason, they follow this method. Yeah, so moving from data to hypothesis to testing to affirming or judging, the adequacy of one's definition. I think that's what's implicit when Sam Harris talks about reason, sort of a scientific methodology, right? But usually embedded in that scientific methodology is kind of what Logarithm would call a naive realism. Right? That most of what knowing has to do with is seeing what's there to be seen and not seeing anything that's not there to be seen. Right? So it's about objectivity at the experiential level, which may not be adequate. But it's also often the case that, especially in the horizon of love, that all of our deciding, judging, understanding, and experiences is transformed within that presiding experience of love. Yeah. So that when we come back around up through the process, it's different. But all these things are happening together inside the unity of the human subject. So in a sense, to oppose faith to reason is simply to oppose the human to itself. Some kind of a schizoid problem. So it's the same subject that reasons from evidence to conclusions as falls in love and is transformed. So affirming the complementarity of faith and reason then is first and foremost a matter of attending to the operations of the human subject, living and thinking in the horizon of faith. It is a result of what Logarithm calls self-appropriation. On that basis, we might come to some consensus on what we mean by faith and reason, and relate them to two vectors in human conscious intentionality, rather than two opposed bodies of thought. Thank you.
It's the practice at the Socratic Club to have a commentator, respondent, to draw up issues and promote our conversation. Our commentator today is Dr. Jeannot of the Philosophy Department. Pass off the mic. Love the technology.
Well, let me begin by apologizing for being late. This is a fun, inductive reasoning. The Socratic Club starts at 4:30. Catholic intellectual tradition affirms the complementarity of faith and reason. This affirmation is reason, but many obstacles stand in the way of a reflective grasp of its reasonableness. Professor might goes to the heart of the matter. If neither faith nor reason is a univocal term, then we will be compelled to ask whose faith and which rationality. As to faith, it would be imbecilic to say that all faiths are the same faith. As to reason, Joe rightly observes that there is nowhere to be found in the Western philosophical tradition a consensus on epistemology, and so no consensus on what is meant by rationality or reason. Once Joe's two questions come into play, however, they also complicate matters considerably. So he asks, how are we to embrace the complementarity of faith and reason when the variations of each are many? Should we then despair of arriving at consensus? Joe answers, Lonergan thought not. Then he walks us through a Lonerganian way of negotiating this complex terrain. He walks us through Lonergan's cognitional theory under the heading of generalized empirical method. Then, with cognitional theory in hand, he turns next to a Lonerganian clarification of the nature and the experienced reality of faith in a world mediated by meaning. He writes, and Joe, I took this to be a crucial paragraph. Faith is not, in the first instance, a matter of affirming certain abstract propositions, or even upholding their meanings as true. Faith is concrete. It is an experience. It is most closely related to the experience of falling in love. Lonergan sometimes describes faith as the knowledge born of religious love. At other times, he describes it as the eyes of being in love. Faith is a certain kind of knowing or a certain way of seeing. The term faith refers to a horizon, a way of living in the world as one who has fallen in love. If faith is reduced to intellectual assent, it appears to oppose what reason affirms to be true based on generalized empirical method. But if faith refers to being in love, then faith is the horizon within which one's experiencing, understanding, and judging take place. Faith then refers not to propositional content, but to encounter and relationship. This is the element of faith that people without faith have the hardest time wrapping their heads around. Faith lacks conceptual content. I think this is the key paragraph in Joe's presentation as a whole, and yes, we might have a hard time wrapping our heads around it. So I'll try to remember my Hippocratic oath and add just one brief gloss. Lonergan calls his method generalized empirical method, but he also calls it a transcendental method. The term transcendental might arouse just as much discomfort as Lonergan's notion of an invariant pattern, since the search for something invariant in the architecture of a subject who asks a question might seem like the old, discredited, pre-critical dogmatism hidden inside the velvet glove of the radical openness of inquiry. But perhaps a misunderstanding can be dissipated. Lonergan's appeal to something transcendental is an appeal to transcendental precepts, addressed to ways of being, and formulated in the imperative mood. They compel us to be attentive, to be intelligent, to be reasonable, and to be responsible. A fifth of these, to be loving, constitutes the permeable boundary between nature and grace, and it opens on to the personal horizon concrete living faith. And this is why Professor Jeannot warns us never to equate the positive faith, creed, dogma, and doctrine, with the lived reality of being a Christian. The first of Lonergan's precepts is be attentive. This imperative operates on the level of experience. What we experience constitutes the data relevant to acts of understanding and reasonable affirmation. Lonergan's view is that data fall into two broad kinds, the data of sense and the data of consciousness. The fundamental problem of sense data theory as an account of experience is that it unreasonably excludes the data of consciousness from its account. Of course, there are the classic problems with self-reference in logic and epistemology, but these are not Lonergan's problems. This is because his philosophy and theology proceed from a personal appeal and a personal invitation. The aim, as Lonergan conceives it, is reflective self-appropriation. The acts he invites us to experience, to understand and to judge, are irreducibly first-personal acts, although they always occur in the context of a social setting, and sometimes in the context of community. The first personal appeal to the data of consciousness is an appeal to certain characteristic acts or performances, not to a ghost in a machine or the Skinnerian myth of an inner man who obstinately and for some reason unaccountably refuses to show up in magnetic resonance imaging. The acts in question can be denoted as verbal nouns. Their object is what we talk about when we talk about experiencing, understanding, and judging, as well as deciding and loving. These are acts in the Aristotelian and Thomistic sense. To adopt a 20th century term, they are intentional. We have it within ourselves to experience, understand, and affirm ourselves through the acts themselves that constitute experience, understanding, and reflective judgment. But Lonergan's account of the transcendental precepts is intelligible only if we admit the notion of interiority, or the concrete reality of the inner life that each of us has and lives. If it should prove to be the case that a subject or person has no inner life, which is just as concretely a matter of fact as the blue of the blue, blue sky or the red of the red, red rose, then Lonerganian philosophy and theology would fold like a house of cards. But in that case, too, there would be no such thing as a person except nominally. It might seem like a mistake to take Kierkegaard's name in the same breath as Lonergan, but what they share in common is their joint attempt to work out a cartography of the inner life and what can be discovered there. So each one writes a philosophy that makes a personal appeal, and if faith is to be discovered anywhere inside it, it must be primarily on these grounds, on a way of living in the world, and Joe, I thought this was quite lovely, on a way of living in the world as one who has fallen in love. Thank you. So when I had a chance to read the paper in advance, and listening to it just now, I thought, Joe, that you were emphasizing more the community in the dialectic of person and community, and then my remarks are more addressed to the other sides of that dialectic.
Okay, we welcome questions, discussion. And you can question or comment to either speaker or both speakers? Not all at once now.
Okay, well, I'll ask. I'm not a student, except my own benefit. I was intrigued by the notion of, or the definition of faith. I've always seen faith as a trusting of evidence. So I have faith that if I drop something, it's going to fall because the evidence has always been, and not necessarily religious. But in the context of your discussion, it seemed, I guess I wasn't clear how the leap between faith in a general sense to the leap, or to the conclusion that faith is religious, from a religious man, and I have great faith, but it's based upon the preponderance of the evidence. Could you please comment?
Yeah. So the question, just for the sake of the camera, has to do with the difference between thinking of faith in terms of relationship and thinking of faith in terms of the preponderance of evidence or probability. We certainly use the word that way. And it would be inadequate for me to say that this description of faith is complete. It's the first step in the process. So Aquinas does this in Secunda Secundae, the opening question on faith, where he makes a distinction between this original horizon and then the content that comes in as a result of it. So the preponderance of evidence is preponderant to you because of an already ongoing horizon of relationship. So other people will look at that set of evidence and say, nothing there. So, can you, this raises a question of evangelization. Can you persuade people by the evidence that you could assent to a proposition like a God exists? Keep it as simple as that first. As I mentioned in the paper, Vatican I says you can't. Right? And they're drawing that from Paul. Right? That you can know that God exists by things of creation. Okay, so we can at least affirm something like what Aquinas does in those 5 ways of talking about God. Some people call proofs. They're modes of discourse about God, and when all people talk about God, that's what they mean. And the most obvious one is primary causality. But also necessary being, and those two are connected. So you can make those arguments, but that's not going to get somebody to church. So evangelization is loving people into love. So it's the experience of befriending a friend's friend. So this person who I love also loves this other person. Right? And so if Christians don't go around explicating their love for God, it's no wonder that people don't join up. So yeah, there is conceptual content down the line. And as a Catholic, I would want to affirm a whole range of things. But those things are affirmed within a context that's already ongoing. Let's go over here and then over here.
Just how would Lonergan approach the idea of innovation with regard to that conceptual content? In other words, faith, the propositional truth claims of faith that's being changed, over the centuries, right, and the creeds and confessions of various Protestant traditions.
part of that relates to these two dialectics of subject and community. And there's a large terrain in Lonergan's thought that's in a big footnote in the paper that he calls differentiations of consciousness. And it's his way of trying to understand historical development and the patterns in which historical development moves. And so he has a lecture that's published in volume 17 of his collected works on doctrinal pluralism, where he traces out the development of Christian self-understanding and understanding of who God is, therefore, over time. And he follows Newman on that. Yeah, so Newman has this idea that to use an image, we asymptotically approach divine truth in history. And so therefore our articulations within the Christian community of divine truth are always approximating that reality, but the reality itself always remains the same. Right? And so the further elaboration then of differentiations of consciousness is a move from common sense experience into theory, and then by the end, as Tom was indicating, into the world of interiority. And so doctrine changes along those lines. And so for Lonergan, his sort of theological project in the end was to try to get all of theology to make this transition into interiority, so that when it goes to articulate its claims, it does so on the grounds of intentionality, analysis, and interiority. Yeah. Want to say that?
No?
Yeah.
How does this address the basic problem that you started with, namely atheists like Sam Harris who draw an antithesis between faith and reason, since that antithesis hinges on a different understanding of faith, namely one that involves propositional content? And so is your solution then kind of an apples and oranges situation, since in many respects these atheists would be quite comfortable with a longer in view of faith?
Yeah, it is an apples and oranges thing. Negations have to mean something, right? I always tell this to my kids. I have an 8-year-old who likes to say no a lot. And a lot of his no's don't mean anything, right? So the scholastic way of framing this is you have to agree on something in order to deny it in the same way. One and the same is knowledge of proposed errors, right? So when Sam Harris says no to faith, it doesn't affect me at all, because it's like me saying, I'm 6 feet tall, and him saying, no, you're blonde. The no doesn't get hold of anything. Yeah? So it just kind of hangs there. And it sounds good rhetorically. I mean, most of what these guys are doing is just polemic, right? It's not really grounded in any understanding of a religious tradition. I mean, Harris makes the claim, he says this in the beginning of The End of Faith, that most people in our world believe that the Creator has written a book. Just think about that for a second. How many religions have a creator? One, mind you. Right? Because it's capital C, creator. It seems like he's completely unaware of the country called China. Right? What's the cosmology there? Who's the creator in what book? So that's not even an adequate claim about reality. But it's that kind of stuff that these people kind of truck in. It's polemic for the sake of polemic. So when you say no, it's got to mean something. And I would hope that atheists would do the service to Christians to help them clarify what it is that they mean. But this particular group isn't really doing that kind of thing. So yeah, it doesn't really get a hold of anything. I can give you other examples from Harris. Always listening.
Directly along that line, it seems, from my understanding of what you said, that at the root of the faith and reason you talked about being different vectors of human experience. But it seems that where they might overlap is in belief. And fundamentally, as you said, you have to believe in something at the root of your faith, of your relationship, as you were describing it. You have to have a belief in the other person or thing. And think that belief is what the atheists would like to deny. They would like to say that belief is contradictory to reason. And I respond to that.
Yeah. So again, for the sake of the camera, I tried to do that before. That the category of belief might be maybe where the problem is, insofar as a critic might want to say that belief in such a person is a problem. Well, one of the things that Christians claim in their creed certain historical facts. There was a man called Jesus, and he died. Those are the two historical facts. And those would be shared by everyone. Now the rest of it gets a little sketchy. So the challenge then is somebody has to say, no, you can't love that person. They'll try to say the person didn't exist. That's a possibility as well. But for me, I think it's like me saying to that person, you can't really love your wife. Does that get at what you're asking?
I think that people, or at least the ones that I know, would not disagree that Jesus existed and died. The two historical facts that we did agree on, or that you claim that everybody can agree on. And I don't think that they would have a problem with you loving him. But I think when you make steps beyond that to say he was also the Son of God, or he was wholly divine, wholly human, these types of statements are where the problem begins to form.
Well, I think this is one of the reasons why your word distinction between an abstract proposition and a kind of experience is entirely relevant. So in the same place in Jeannot, Aquinas distinguishes between preambles of faith, which are demonstrable, and articles of faith, which are not. And these would include the fundamental Christological reformation. And I don't believe any serious Christian has ever claimed to be able to demonstrate the Christological affirmations as a matter of evidence and reason, frankly. So there is a fundamental harmony here and a fundamental complementarity, especially once you introduce the dynamics of conversion, which come in only towards the end of the case, but which you could have spoken a great deal more about. I think it's also pertinent to your remarks about evangelization. So I could, extraordinarily render you and take you to Syria and Waterbury and show you the Senate and the Nicene Creed, but that probably wouldn't be the most successful method of converting you. And on the other hand, if it appears to be to you to be impossible that a man who was crucified, died, and was buried could rise again from the dead, well, Lonergan does a wonderful job and insight of distinguishing between myth and mystery. And at a certain point, I think we're in the domain not of myth, as in Homeric mythology, etc., but in the domain of authentic mystery. But that the sort of mystery that's in play is not essentially different in kind, as I think Joe also brought out. Let me say here in public, too, that I also love my wife. But as to reasons and evidence, you could give me plenty of evidence and reasons why I should not. You give me and then also plenty of reasons why you should, all of which I deem to be irrelevant to what our marital bliss is really all about. So,
It's a very Valentine's Day.
yes, it's and I can hear my wife's voice in the background. I better stop.
No, I think that's helpful.
There's a misplaced demand for a certain kind of intelligibility that doesn't exist in this particular domain, which has to be phenomenologically well clarified first. And then the intelligibility it has is immanent in the experience itself. And is that fair enough? I want to stay faithful to Lonergan here.
I think that's right. And for Christians, the challenge is, and this is what early Christians are figuring out, if we're going to say the things about Jesus that we're saying, we also better say he's God. Otherwise, we're engaged in idolatry. Right? So if this man becomes the summum bonum, certain things start to necessarily follow, otherwise you give it up. Because you're engaged in some kind of distortion of the singularity of God. And that then all these doctrines start to cascade. They're really uninteresting. Right? Once you have a single affirmation, a whole series of things follow, all the way down to the assumption of the BVM in the 1930s, right? It's just a long stream of logical conclusions. She did it. Right? So, and those are all based on the idea that Jesus is God incarnate. And once you say that, a whole lot of things follow. But you say that because you have an experience of this person as the full clarification of the object of my love.
So I had a question pertaining to that. So people of faith have this horizon of faith within the context in which they experience, understand, and judge. And people without that have a different horizon or no horizon at all. I'm not sure what Lonergan said. So if it has to do with the horizon in which we experience, understand, and judge, my question is there a back problem when it comes to people with faith and people without faith? Because if, like, say I'm a sensitive back who can speak English, I may be able to describe what, my subjective experience as that, but I can't make you understand what it is to be a bat. And so if I'm a person of faith, or if you're a person of faith and you've experienced a love relationship with God, and I'm not a person of faith and I haven't, can we communicate? To what extent can we communicate? And then is it possible perhaps that we can't have intellectual conversation, we can only have interpersonal conversation? Is that a coherent question?
No, it's the fundamental problem of horizons. Everyone has a horizon. And so we navigate this terrain regularly without necessarily adverting to it. Right? We all live in different worlds. And the sort of overlapping, have a Venn diagram in your head. The overlap might be greater in certain contexts than when you take yourself out of a situation and you land in some other part of the world. And then you start to get further away from the context. But still, all of us fundamentally live in our own world. So we're always navigating this terrain of exchanging across horizons. And our horizons expand or contract depending on our adherence to detached and disinterested inquiry. They contract with bias and expand with submitting to wonder. But when Lonergan talks about conversion, he talks about a radically new horizon, not a sort of singular expansion of horizon, but setting up a new horizon. It's sort of using his intentionality analysis to describe what's there in Ezekiel, right, of plucking out the heart of stone and putting in the heart of flesh. It's a new way of being in the world that leaves behind so much of what was there. square circle is the same for Christians as it is for atheists. But for the Christian, they might put that intelligibility within this larger horizon of the fully intelligible universe, which is this friendly universe that one enters into at this new horizon. So that those experiences of intelligibility are also then experiences of the divine mind. And so an ongoing deepening of relationship with the object of one's love. But the content's not necessarily different. Does that make sense?
Yeah. I guess my question is that if you're experiencing the same content, like you said, you don't necessarily experience different realities. I don't know, I suppose I still have the same question. Can you talk about the content intellectually for only English? I mean, is it just like, I don't know, maybe I just don't understand your answer.
No, it's probably just not clear.
I'd like to comment on that.
Maybe we have different horizons.
So I think it's just interesting in general how people have this idea that either you have faith or you don't have faith. I think as human beings, at some point we assent to certain things, like naturally. Like even as we walk out the door, we have faith that like our feet work well enough that we can do that. I think it's kind of absurd to say that, you know, there's a group of people that are believers and there's a group of people that aren't believers. And like one example that I recollect in my mind is from a book that I read, and a priest is talking to this man who's getting ready to get married, and he's converting to the church, and he's like, well, I get, like intellectually, I get all of this, I get all the stuff, I understand all the truths of the church, but I just don't have that relationship with Jesus. And he realized that he doesn't have faith. And the idea behind faith is that it's a supernatural gift. It's not something you can intellectualize and receive that way. It's something that when you ask for it, you're given. So it's like, I just think it's interesting how people naturally hold this idea, well, I'm really a scientific mind and I don't have faith, or vice versa, or I'm so faithful and I have all this faith, but you know, all this intellectual stuff just doesn't appeal to me. So I think it's just an interesting dichotomy that we hold naturally. We're really like, you need both. And that's, at some point in our lives we'll realize like, well, actually I do have a little bit of faith, or actually I do know a little bit more than I did. So I just think, I guess to clarify on that, it's like, it's not a matter of like whether you have faith or not, it's just what are you willing to assent to, in a sense. So.
Yeah, I think I get what you're saying. The terms get loose, and that's where the problem is, right? So if faith is an encounter of love, you either love somebody or you don't. Now, like you say, you can assent to a lot of things at a sort of intellectual level. It would be pretty weird to assent to the Trinity absent certain statements about Jesus. That would be sort of an odd thing.
Yeah, I think I've heard that faith isn't irrational, but it's supra-rational.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah,
Yeah.
so and that's why I think that this imaging of the continuity is an image of the perfecting of nature by grace, or the fulfillment of reason by faith. Those are, you know, sort of formulas from the Catholic tradition that we know. So that what's there in any person is not, it's not like your body changes or something like that when you fall in love, but it's a reorientation of everything, right? And so it is. You have this vector coming from above down is supernatural stuff. Right? It's a supernatural gift. Right? So there's nothing you can do on the way up to get it. You know, this is the big debate between Augustine and Pelagians. Right? It's always gift. Yeah. And then we can say things like, was it Pascal that said you wouldn't be seeking me if you had not already found me. Right? So then the seeking is radically transformed. But the trick is you don't always necessarily know that you're you're in love with God, you can experience love as sort of simply intellectual desire without a proper object. And that's why that little thing there is the top one you'll notice is in parentheses. It's not an intentional act that necessarily emerges as a response to deciding. It's an experience of being in love and asking, what am I in love with? So when we were talking about our wives, as sometimes people are wont to do, we talk about falling in love. Right? Sometimes that's a real pain. You don't want it to happen. Anybody who's been to high school probably knows that. And we don't really know what it is about the thing that's lovable necessarily. Right? When you get married, you don't do the tables of pros and cons. Maybe some particular person. Some people might also, ask if you want to propagate the race with me. I doubt that happens. Keep it for ritual. So it's a falling in love that sets up a new horizon, and it is fundamentally a gift. It happens before one does anything to make it happen. And so it's in the parentheses, these other things in red, the questions, they just occur, right? Sometimes it's frustrating because questions just pop up. We don't work ourselves into questions. We don't figure out a question. No, it happens to you. So the love of God is analogous to that. It's what Thomas calls apathy, or something that you suffer. Right? Not something you kind of work your way into. The question still stands, and I think it's a good question because it's insisting on discovering the overlap, so that you don't have this species of thing called Christian that's of a different kind, which would violate the sort of the continuum between nature and grace.
I'd just like to very quickly add that I'd urge you not to be too insistent on the distinction between intellectual and interpersonal. So there's another term, pre-evangelization. So now, if you take the Holy Trinity, the Hitchens, Dawkins, and Harris, there are also certain presuppositions operative in their thought. And they're either philosophically sound or they're philosophically unsound. Now, in all three cases, they turn out to be, whether they're aware of it or not, metaphysically committed to physicalism. And it's physicalism an appropriate way to think about what's real. That won't be the subject of this afternoon's meeting, but let's say for the sake of the argument that the answer to that question is no. Especially if the universe of being is a world mediated by meaning. No physicalist could adequately account for a world in which there are persons, the world itself being mediated by meaning in the three ways that Joe described in the body of his talk. So those are genuinely philosophical considerations. And I like replies and objections as a method of proceeding. I like taking a pugilistic approach to properly philosophical questions. Because people can and do make philosophical mistakes. And they can be identified and then criticized. So, before there's any experience of the falling in love with God, we have to live in a kind of reality in which that's an ontological possibility. And if you develop the sort of metaphysics that a priori rule out that possibility, well, then that's what philosophers have done for a very long time now, is kick the bejesus out of inadequate metaphysical accounts of what's real. And they keep popping up like weeds in your garden, and you have to keep your metaphysical spade and whatever you got from the chemical manufacturer hand-to-hand use.
So, would you agree that Christianity, I suppose any religion with holy text, put a tremendous amount of faith in mankind, and in Christianity's case, mankind, that in all other cases is this innately corrupt and untrustworthy creature. But now in this case, a good deal of beliefs rest upon what some chaps wrote in the first century CE. So, I mean, not Christianity only, but I mean, say Hinduism, Buddhism, any religions. So it's, I'd say, well, would you agree that a lot, if they're not equal, that more faith is invested in man than there is in God? I was left in the dust a little bit with the dialectic of subject and community, but what I took from it was that that faith is sort of this heirloom handed down from generation to generation of man, and so we take for granted what these sort of forefathers of religion have put down.
Yeah, so first on the question of whether or not human beings are innately corrupt, there are certain Christians that say things like that. Generally, the Catholic tradition has resisted saying that. Corruption is sin, it's not nature. So nature is good. So that's just the theological implication. There are Christians in this room who probably disagree with me. That's where I am. Now, if that's the case, then if you have a sort of generally positive theological anthropology, then it can be the case that human beings can encounter the divine and know it when they see it. And so that's what these writers who are the authors of the Gospels are doing. And so the Gospel then is a particular kind of literature. It's a depiction of an event that requires a response from the reader. And the question as it's captured in Matthew is, who do you say that I am? And anybody who reads that book is confronted with that question. And insofar then as the writer puts the question to posterity, they answer. And they answer in large part based on the testimony of the author. And so yeah, testimony plays a massive part of what it means to be a Christian. And there would be no Christians but for the testimony. Right? They wouldn't just kind of pop out of nowhere. Yeah? And that's why I talk about loving someone into love, because it's receiving a story about, you got to meet my friend over here. He was pretty bad. Yeah. Did all these things, helped us to understand who we are, etc. And it's based on that testimony then that one would say, wow, this person, I really am finding myself falling for him.
I think what you said about without testimony there would be no Christian, I think therein the problem lies. That without the written account of Jesus being God, would any of us today know that Jesus was God? Say he died off and all of the disciples have been slain by the Romans. Would we be in the dark about Jesus being God, or would that have just sort of evaporated?
It's distinctly possible. Thus the great evangelical imperative of being Christian. Because and this gets into larger questions of whether or not then this is the definitive self-communication or something like that. Could there be another story or something? What it means to say that in the fullness of time God sends the Son, etc., etc. The Father sends the Son. But it's just admitting the basic historical fact that human beings live in this world mediated by meaning, and that among the meanings that are mediated from generation to generation are things we call religious truths. And then say that, again, going back to the prior conversation, that, and this is where you run into a problem with narrative in the long run, that I'm just going to stay with it for now. That the narrative is trying to mediate an encounter. And it's only within that encounter that the narrative takes on a different meaning. Yeah, so a lot of people read the Bible and they don't necessarily go in for Jesus, right? But that's this medium by which the message is mediated. So can we say, when you make sort of universalist claims about Christian truth or something like that, well, students will ask me in class, what if you grew up in India, would you be a Christian? And I say, probably not. That's not what happened. Right? So it's one thing then to, and this goes back to that subject and community, to emerge into a story. And it's a different thing than over time to make that story one's own. And that's just part of the ongoing process of differentiation from one's received tradition, which we all do in some either greater or lesser extent. But yeah, I couldn't honestly say, of course I'd be a Christian, because again, it's not rationally demonstrable. This is what you should believe. It depends on a private relationship.
We have reached the end of our allotted time. If it's a Friday afternoon and folks might need to move on, please feel free to take off if you need to. Some of us will stick around and continue the conversation. I want to let you know our next meeting is March the 20th. Dr. Dwayne Armitage of the Gonzaga Philosophy Department is going to be picking up on the theme of love and talking about Kierkegaard on eros and the paradox of the self. So jot that down. Hope we see you next month. Thanks for coming.